Today we have a special guest, Dr. Pieter J. Leithart, the founder and the president of Theopolis Institute. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Peter is now in Ivano-Frankivsk, Ukraine, and he is speaking about the books of Samuel and Kings. But a week before, you also came to Budapest to speak at a conference on the topic of liturgy.
Yes.
So I would like to combine these two themes, first liturgy, and then especially what you wrote in your commentary on the books of Kings, and have a brief discussion with you about that.
Very good.
So in your commentary on the books of Kings, you write that wisdom cannot save Israel from division, that Torah cannot save Judah from destruction, and even the temple is finally torn apart. And you say that all that made Israel, Israel is undone, so that there is no salvation for Israel from within Israel. You still hold to these words.
Yes. Should I elaborate?
Wait, because I would like to connect this with the conference that we had with you in Budapest a week ago. Because in Budapest, you argued that what at first glance actually seems like a reverse motion, that liturgy is the source of culture and all of life of a society, that worship makes the world. Should we read the end of Kings then as a liturgical unmaking, a culture coming apart because its cult had failed at the root?
I think that's a good way to talk about the end of Kings. Let me elaborate a little bit on what you quoted from my commentary on Kings. What I'm referring to in that summary is the failure of Solomon, who's the wise king in the book of Kings. He fails by going after idols, intermarrying with foreign women and beginning to worship their gods. And because of that, this wise king ends up setting up the division of the kingdom. The Torah-keeping king in the book of Kings is Josiah. And Josiah is a perfect Torah keeper. He does exactly what Torah requires. He obeys God and loves God with his whole heart and soul. But that's not good enough. At that point in Judah's history, it's too late because Manasseh's abominations are still on the Lord's mind. And even the great reform of Josiah doesn't rescue them from exile. The same thing happens to the temple. The temple was set up as a house of prayer. Israel is supposed to go to the temple, pray toward the temple, and they'll be delivered from every kind of curse and every kind of judgment. But they don't do it. They turn to other gods. They use the temple to plunder it and use the gold and silver of the temple to manipulate and pay off enemies. They misuse the temple, and so the Lord destroys it. I don't think that contradicts what I was saying in Budapest last weekend. It is true that liturgy is the center of culture. In fact, I would say, as I do in my book, The Theopolitan Liturgy, that the liturgy is itself the first form of Christian culture. It's probably easiest to see when we think about language. It's not just that the liturgy transforms the language outside the liturgy, but language is being transformed in the liturgy. New words are being formulated, new ways of speaking, new ways of naming the world. Biblical ways of naming the world are being taught and practiced and seep into the people in the liturgy. So the language of the church is being formed in the liturgy itself. But what you have in Kings, of course, is a misuse of that, the great power of the liturgy and the great power of the temple. And because Israel doesn't use the temple as the Lord intended, and because Israel turns instead to other gods, God does unmake their world as a whole. And at the center of their world, as you said, is the temple, and God unmakes the temple. That's part of a death and resurrection theme that's going all the way through Kings. The temple will be rebuilt beyond the book of Kings. That liturgical center will be restored. But at the end of Kings, because of Israel's sins, that center, that source of life for them is unmade.
But it sounds very discouraging to me, because what basically, if I understand you well, you want to say that we can have Torah, we can have even the wisdom of King Solomon. We can have the temple or worship. And yet, even with all these three elements, we can fail as a church or as a society.
Yeah. Well, notice what's happening though in Kings. In each of those categories, we're talking about a misuse or an abandonment. Solomon is the great sage of the book of Kings, but he begins to worship other gods. That's not a wise thing to do. Or he continues to have his wisdom, his skill for organizing great building projects, but instead of building and enhancing the temple of the Lord, he begins to build other temples for other gods, and he spends the latter part of his reign building temples for other gods. With the Torah, with Josiah and the Torah keeping, the problem there is the stage in Israel's history that happens. There does come a point of no return for Judah. Manasseh is the point of no return. Manasseh is the worst king in the history of Judah. And after Manasseh, the Lord is determined he's going to wipe out Judah. And even the great reform of Josiah is not enough. If there had been repentance and that kind of Torah keeping earlier in Judah's history, they would have been able to turn things around. And the temple, again, as I mentioned, is misused. It's not used as a house of prayer as it's designed to be used. There are idols. Manasseh puts idols right in the temple, right before the Lord's face. And so all of those things are abandoned or misused. It's not the proper use of wisdom or the proper use of Torah or the temple that leads to destruction. It's when those are misused. So you can have the presence of those things, but if you don't faithfully use them, then yes, it's going to lead to destruction.
Do you think that it is significant that it starts with the most wise king in Israel abandoning the ways of wisdom that he tried to teach even to his own sons, that this is the first step that eventually leads to the destruction of the temple and the exile?
Yeah, that's a really good insight, because wisdom, as you know, is the particular virtue of kings. The knowledge of good and evil, as it's called in Genesis 2 and 3. It's also knowledge of good and evil in 1 Kings 3, when Solomon asked for wisdom. He asked for wisdom to be able to judge the people, to discern between good and evil. So this is a royal virtue. Wisdom is a royal virtue. And so the abandonment of wisdom, he gives up the fear of the Lord and begins to fear other gods. The abandonment of true wisdom means that, Torah keeping and the temple are not going to be, Torah keeping is not going to be faithful. The temple is not going to be used properly. And the point that you make about passing on wisdom to his sons is key. Solomon himself keeps the kingdom together. It's the failure of his son Rehoboam that leads to the actual split in the kingdom. But that's also Solomon's error. It's his mistake, which is jarring, because the book of Proverbs, a large part of the book of Proverbs is Solomon speaking to his son, trying to train his son in royal wisdom. Rehoboam obviously didn't get the message. There's some disconnect between father and son there. And so Solomon didn't communicate his wisdom to his son, who could then have communicated to his son, and so on. And because of that, these other things unravel. So the beginning of it for the kings is an abandonment of wisdom and abandonment of fearing God, and then the other things follow from that.
And Solomon's sons basically goes against all the main pieces of advice that Solomon tried to give him.
Right. One of the first things that Solomon says in Proverbs is, be careful about the mob.
Yeah.
If sinners entice you, don't consent. Don't listen to your friends. Your peer group is going to mislead you. Listen to the wise, and you will be wise. And Rehoboam, of course, consults with his foolish peers, and they give him bad advice. He takes that. He doesn't take the wise advice of his elders. So a very, very clear a defiance of Solomon's wisdom in the way that Rehoboam behaves.
It even looks like a prophecy that is
Proverbs
fulfilled
does.
In a reversed way.
Yes, right, yes.
Maybe Solomon wrote the book too late?
Perhaps, yeah. But he does present it as teaching his son.
Yeah.
You assume that was being done when his son was pliable and could be taught. Something's going on, whether it's Solomon's failures that get passed on to Rehoboam, or Rehoboam closing his ears to the wisdom of his father. There's, as there often is in Samuel and Kings, we've talked about this in the lectures, there's a gap between the fathers and the sons, and fathers have a very difficult time passing on wisdom and righteousness to their sons. That's one of the big problems in the history of Israel.
So, do you think that it was maybe not basically, but one of the problems was the transition of what both wisdom and Torah stood for or contained?
Right.
That Solomon was not the best teacher, perhaps.
There's some failure of teaching, yes. And I think that the Torah fits into that category too. Proverbs is a father's instruction to his son. When Josiah is commended for his Torah keeping, the passage that Kings alludes to is Deuteronomy 6.
Mm-hmm.
Josiah loves the Lord with his heart and his soul, the way Deuteronomy 6 requires. But if you look back at Deuteronomy 6, and as it goes on, what Deuteronomy 6 tells the lover of God to do is to speak of the Torah when he rises, when he sits down, when he's in the way, to make sure he passes on that heritage to his children. So there is a failure of continuity in Torah as well as wisdom throughout the history of Judah.
So maybe then we should go back to the conference in Budapest, where you combined the song, the table,
yes,
the book,
yes,
with the leader.
Right.
Because it looks like failure in leadership in the end.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. The paradigm that I used in Budapest, I drew from the latter chapters of Deuteronomy, where Moses is preparing Israel to enter the land and conquer the land. And he prepares them by appointing Joshua as his successor. Moses knows he's not going to enter the land and lead the people in the conquest. So he gives them a new Moses, which is Joshua. He makes sure that the book is preserved, that Joshua has a copy of the book, that the book is kept in the most holy place of the tabernacle. There's a copy of the book that's read out at the festival every 7 years. The Levites and priests have the book so that they can teach it to the people, and that's taught through generations. He composes a song, and that song is the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32. And all of that is to give Israel the tools that they need to enter the land and to conquer it. And the purpose of conquering the land is to clear out the idols and to build the Lord's house at the place that he chooses. He's going to set his name at a particular chosen place. And that's going to be the place where God shows hospitality. That's the table that God sets up in the land. But yeah, I think it's a very, very interesting and insightful point to say that you can have the word, you can have the song, you can have the table, you can have all these liturgical fixtures, but if you don't have faithful leaders, then none of those things function. None of those things function properly. You obviously have to have leaders that are teaching the book, leaders that are teaching the people to sing, leaders that welcome the people in proper hospitality, which includes excluding people from hospitality if they prove unfaithful. So without faithful leaders, none of those liturgical and communal institutions works. And then if you have a failure of leaders to pass on what they have to the next generation, then you might have one generation of relative faithfulness, but the book and the song and the table are not going to have continuity without faithful leaders. Just to put in a plug for our institute in Birmingham, Theopolis Institute, that's one of the reasons why we focus on training church leaders. We want to have leaders who are teaching the word, leading the people in song, welcoming people at the Lord's table. But they need to be faithful leaders themselves, both in their work as ministers and as men of God. They have to be faithful in their own hearts and souls, lovers of the Lord Jesus and followers of the Lord Jesus. And that's the only way you can get any kind of continuity of faithfulness in the church.
But if that is the hardest part for the continuity, right?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Also for a fruitful development and growth of churches and families and societies, what kind of advice would you give to people who want to train the next generation in faithfulness?
Yeah.
Because it seems to me that we should expect more from the teachers than from the students,
Yes.
who cannot just tell the students that they are bad, lazy students.
Right.
Sometimes it's the problem with the teacher,
Yeah.
even though not always.
No, correct. In the lectures here in Ivano-Frankivsk, I talked about the failures of relation between fathers and sons, the failure of fathers to pass on the heritage to their sons, and also cited right at the end of Malachi in our English Bibles. I think it's true in the Ukrainian Bible. I don't know.
Yes.
Malachi is the last book of the Bible. And the very last verse of the very last book of the Old Testament is a promise that Elijah is going to come and he's going to turn the hearts of the fathers to the sons and the hearts of the sons to the fathers. And I think that's a promise. Certainly the Elijah promise is a promise that's fulfilled with the coming of John in the Gospels. That's fulfilled as a preparation for the coming of the Messiah. So I think that promise of reuniting the generations is a promise of the new covenant. So I think at the beginning, the foundation of the answer to your question is confidence that the Lord is preserving and knitting those generations together, and trusting the Lord to do that. You can't try to train a new generation out of fear. You can't or anxiety or worry about whether you're going to be able to accomplish it. You have to do it in faith, trusting the Lord is going to use your always flawed efforts to produce fruit in the next generation. The other thing that I would say in response to your question is to talk about Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy, who is a favorite writer of both of us. Rosenstock-Huessy was, as you know, a German-American philosopher and historian and polymath. He was an expert on many different subjects. One of his central essays, I think, is called "Man Must Teach."
Yes.
And he talks about the classroom as the place where the generations are united. And the generations are united by teachers who are in the position of being the older member, the earlier generation. Even if they aren't literally, they know more about the subject matter. Usually the teacher is older than the students. So they bring the past to bear on the students. And the way that Rosenstock-Huessy describes it is they throw a line into the future. They bring the heritage and the tradition of the past, and they teach in order to have that pass on to the future, pass on to the sons that they're teaching. The sons enter the classroom in a different state. Rosenstock-Huessy says that they're not contemporaries. They don't share a time. They're distemporaries. They're coming from two different times. The fathers come from the old time, the sons coming from future time, but they need to be rooted in the past. So they need to send a line out to the past and get rooted and anchored in the past so that they can move on into the future with the heritage that they gain from their teachers. So I think that's a beautiful picture of how proper teaching operates. You have generations that are separated by time, separated by maturity, separated by knowledge, but in the classroom or in any kind of classroom-like setting, teaching that goes on in the church would apply. Well, it would be an example of this. You have that union of generations, and the teachers have to think ahead to the future. What they're trying to do is put their imprint on the future that they won't live to see, and they do that not by trying to be like the students. I mean, that's been the flaw of a lot of contemporary.
Yes, I agree.
Contemporary education and contemporary church life. The pastors try to be like the youngest member of the church. They accommodate themselves as the most immature member. That's not what actually passes on the heritage. What passes on the heritage is recognizing that they represent the past. They are the old member. They're the old party in this communion, and their goal is to bring that past to bear onto the present of the student in the classroom and into the future of that student.
Well, but Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy also says that the teacher basically belongs to the past,
Yes,
which on his cross of reality is only one of the arms.
correct.
And it's a very important role. Teachers, parents, they need to root the kids, the next generations in the past, because without this anchoring in the past, who knows where they will float.
Right.
Or go. But he also speaks about the imperative way of addressing people. Can a teacher actually do this? Like call them into the future?
I think so. Let me get back to that question and talk about that a little bit. But I think the way the bringing up the cross of reality, which is one of Rosenstock-Huessey's main ideas, that I think helps to see what the teacher's role is. Rosenstock-Huessey thinks it's an immature position to be exclusively devoted to the past.
Yeah.
To be truly mature, you have to live between the past and the future. Both the past and the future have proper claims on you, and you have to live in the tension of that. You have to be stretched out between the past and the future. So one thing that teachers can't do is just try to perpetuate the past and just try to replicate the past in the next generation. They need to root their students in the past, but they don't want to just pass on what they're doing so it's replicated. I think there's a lot of there's various forms of the Christian tradition where that's the form of teaching. It's just maintaining the same thing generation after generation. Students won't receive that. The children who represent the future, the sons who represent the future, are not going to receive that or not receive it well, because they have aspirations of their own. They have a call to the future. And so the teacher has to wisely teach the past in such a way that the son of the future knows how to carry that on into the future and actually carve out new pathways in the future, do new things in the future, but rooted in the past. The imperative is very important to Rosenstock-Huessey, and that I think is again a crucial part of the answer to your earlier question about how do teachers do this. Again, we can think about the flaw of contemporary education, including temporary education in the church, where there's a reluctance to command. There's a reluctance to issue imperatives and to say, this is what you must do. But Rosenstock-Huessey, I think, very insightfully and brilliantly points out that the command, the imperative, is what carves out a future. When the commander of the platoon gives a command, charge, that's giving his soldiers permission to go into battle, and it's setting them on a future course. It's pushing them into the future, and that's the way commands work. And so that's another element, of course, of good teaching. As another element of making sure that we're passing on the heritage into the future is having that imperative command element in it, and not being afraid of that, not worrying about we're going to offend students. I think, in fact, the imperative, the call, the summons to the students, to the sons, is something that galvanizes and excites them and gives them a sense of mission and purpose. Mm-hmm. So again, you're balancing or stretching out between these two things. You want to bring the past to bear. You want to give commands that lay out a new future. You want to throw a line into the future so that what you're teaching them guides them into a future that you can't anticipate. That's a very challenging thing to do, but that's the kind of mentality and approach that I think effective teaching requires.
And actually, this is how God addresses man from the very beginning.
Yeah.
He tells him or them,
yes,
be fruitful, multiply, and go. Right?
Right.
This is a command.
Yes, right.
Maybe we don't pay enough attention to
the imperative form.
To the imperative form that is there in the Bible from the very beginning.
It's there in Genesis 1, the passage you're citing. Of course, it's there in Genesis 2, again, a different sort of command. Do not eat from the tree that's in the middle of the garden, but it starts out with an imperative, right?
And the Abraham story also starts with a command.
Yes, it does. That's, I think, is you said earlier, kind of connected the idea of an imperative with a call.
Yeah.
And that's very much what's happening to Abraham. He's told to go, but that command to go is also a summons, a call. It sets out a vocation. That's a great biblical example of an imperative that sets out a future, an unanticipated future, a future that Abraham can't plot out ahead of time. He doesn't know where he's going.
Yeah.
He gets a command and he goes, and he has to trust the Lord to make his path apparent to him as he goes. So yeah, that's a great example of the command, the imperative, having that character of a call.
I'm tempted to connect this actually with the topic of eschatology. because it seems to me that...
Do not resist that temptation.
Is there a particular form of Christian eschatology who actually helps us to achieve this, this procession of generations that actually follow each other, not only in time, but also sharing the same vision and goal?
Yeah.
How would you call this?
Let me start with the opposite, as I have done several times during the course of our conversation. I think the eschatology that doesn't lend itself to that is an eschatology that says, who knows if the next generation if there'll be a world for the next generation. Jesus might come back any moment. We have to prepare only for the short term. We can't prepare for the long term. That's not the vision of the Bible. And however I do have obviously some thoughts about the question you asked, but however we work out the details, the mentality that the Bible gives us is the mentality of the second word, which promises blessing to 1,000 generation of those who love God. So that's not been the mentality of...
Thousands in Hebrew plural.
Thousands plural, thousands of generations, right? To those who love God and keep his commandments. That's not been the mentality of Christians in recent centuries. It was the mentality of Christians in the past. Christians who would begin cathedral projects that they know would not be finished for 100 or 150 years. The compilers of the Book of Common Prayer who put in 6,000 years of a calendar that covers 6,000 years of festivals for the Christian calendar. The Christians had this kind of vision of the future, which gave them an orientation to think in terms of multiple generations and trying to sustain the faith through multiple generations, rather than just trying to hold on until Jesus comes. The typical name for that kind of eschatology, of course, is postmillennialism, which is taking its name from the millennium in Revelation 20. I think sometimes putting too much focus on the millennium, I think, is distracting. I think it's this long-term vision, the long-term vision with a promise of blessing to 1,000 generations, thousands of generations, the promise that God intends to bless the nations through Abraham's seed. That's the mentality that the Bible teaches us to have, and that's the kind of eschatological perspective we need to cultivate.
And it also provides this hope against hope, because we know that it will not be easy, and the books of Kings remind us.
Right. Yeah. Go back to the Book of Kings, and as you said, it can be kind of depressing to read the Book of Kings, because the things that Israel has that are great treasures for Israel don't sustain them because they don't use them properly. That looks like that could be a depressing message. But the larger point of the Book of Kings, as I pointed out this morning in my lecture, is God's faithfulness to the house of David. And in spite of all those failures of Israel, in spite of the misuse of these gifts, the Lord keeps raising David from the dead, and he keeps sustaining the Davidic house. He keeps going through these, sustaining Israel, at least a remnant of Israel, through these catastrophes. And he continues to do that throughout history. And in every period, in every place where there's a crisis for the church, God forms a faithful remnant that's going to get through the crisis, is going to be the seed of a new and renewed Christianity. And our calling is to trust the Lord. As you said, hope against hope. That's language of Paul from the book of Romans. That describes Abraham's hope for a future that he can't see. It's a future abundance of children when he's aging and his wife has a barren womb, and he still believes that God was able to raise the dead. That's the kind of faith that we need, especially in times of crisis and times of upheaval, when the church seems to be falling apart. But when we have the long-term vision and are confident in the long-term promises of God, that sustains us through those times of crisis.
But that also means that we need to read the Bible in a particular way, not so much as a collection of principles or dogmas or some abstract ethical imperatives, like Kant would say, but basically as one big history.
Yes. I know you would agree with this, but those things that you mentioned are all there in the Bible.
Yes, yes.
There are principles, there are guidelines, there are laws, there are commandments. All those things are part of the biblical record. But yes, the overall shape of the Bible is an account of human history. And getting a grasp of that, I think, is essential. The Bible is not primarily about my personal experience as a believer, my personal experience as a believer, or the personal experiences of those characters who are in the Bible is incorporated into the story. But there's a larger story that the Lord is telling and a larger work that the Lord is doing, beginning with creation and the command that you mentioned to take dominion and rule the earth. That's God's purpose for creation. He intends for creation to be filled with glory, to be transformed from the original garden into a great garden city. And that's the purpose that God has for humanity and for the world. And that's what the Bible is about, the gradual realization of that vision. And studying the Bible that way, reading the Bible in that fashion, we kind of get into the rhythm of that story. The story becomes part of our makeup. We're incorporated into the story, and we recognize that we're a continuation of the story that begins with Adam, goes through Abraham, goes through the history of Israel, goes through the story of Jesus and the apostles, and it continues on as God realizes his promises to Abraham.
So would you say that one of the safeguards that we can somehow build into our life as churches, families, societies is the liturgical calendar, like the church year, that actually reminds us about the story again and again, year after year?
Yeah, I think the church calendar is a great pedagogical tool. Israel's calendar played that role in Israel. Israel had a weekly Sabbath that was a day of holy convocation, but they also had an elaborate liturgical calendar where they celebrated particular festivals that commemorated events from Israel's history: the Passover, the giving of the law at Sinai, their time in the wilderness, and when they lived in tents. They reenact that every year at the Feast of Booths. So every year they're going through this cycle of, they're kind of reliving their history every year. The Christian calendar is a transformation of that.
Yeah.
And the things that are highlighted in the Christian calendar are the events of the life of Jesus that culminate with the giving of the Spirit at Pentecost, which is the Spirit of Jesus being poured out and empowering the church to carry on the mission and the work of Jesus in the world. And so every year, a church that's following the Christian calendar is moving through that story, being renewed in that story. That story becomes part of the rhythm of our lives. That story gets worked into us. Just as one practical illustration of that, I grew up in a liturgical church that followed a liturgical calendar and heard the gospel accounts of the Passion of Jesus, particularly the Gospel of John, nearly every year when I was growing up. There are long stretches of the Passion narrative in John that I never sat down to memorize, but are basically committed to memory.
Yeah.
They're part of my mental furniture, just because I heard them year after year after year. Same with the Christmas accounts and other major events of Jesus' life. Those things are kind of they get worked into you and become part of your soul, and they shape your soul, and they shape the life of the community as we reenact those and as we celebrate those that cycle every year.
But they are also pointers that guide us, lead us into the future, right? And this is, as we talked, or mostly you talked, this is also a very important part of our Christian life.
Yes.
We don't want only to relive or return
Right.
to the past
Yes.
patterns, but we also want to learn from these patterns as we move forward.
Yeah, and I think that you're right, that's a we put that back in Rosenstock-Hues's paradigm.
Yeah.
It's not just repeating the past. That would be immaturity if we're just reenacting the past. We are rooted in the past, and that's part of what the church calendar does. But the church calendar is also giving us this perspective on the future. Every celebration that we have in the church calendar has a future eschatological dimension to it. Jesus enters, his advent is in the flesh, is appointed ultimately to the advent, to his final advent, but also to his regular advents, his regular comings to us. the Lent, when we are remembering and meditating on the sufferings of Jesus, not only remind us of the sufferings of Jesus, but also prepare us for the suffering, martyrdom, the suffering witness that we are called to. Easter, of course, points us to a final resurrection, but also to the various resurrections that we experience in the course of our lives, in the course of the history of the church. So yeah, every celebration of the church calendar has this double past and future orientation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Boo Boo. It's been a delight.
It's been a delight every time you come here over, or every time we can meet you on the other side of the ocean.
Thank you.
May God bless your ministry, your family, your church.
And
Thank
blessings to you as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And welcome. I would like to welcome you and encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Christopolis. God bless you.